Welcome to the 70th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. Our aim for these podcasts is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management, and we welcome your feedback. You can also find Crossing Thin Ice in your Substack feed. My name is Max Rudolph, and as always, I'm joined by Dave Ingram. Today, Dave is going to share his thoughts on business success. This is the third and final discussion of this series, with this one focused on how good execution can be integrated into your risk management process to make better choices. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We're here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds.
You can have the most brilliant strategy in the world, the best idea, and you can pick the perfect time to launch it. But if you can't nail the execution, all that genius falls apart. Think about a major company launching a new product, like an app or a service. They spend months on marketing. The design is beautiful, the market is ready, but on launch day, a critical server crashes, or the checkout button doesn't work. The idea was great, the timing was right, but a tiny flaw in the execution destroyed the whole effort. That's the difference between a successful business and one that's stuck spinning its wheels. A couple of weeks ago, I suggested that it is not risk, that it's good judgment, good timing, and good execution that are the real drivers of business profits. Today, I want to focus on what I believe is the most significant of those three, good execution. It's hard. It requires many different teams within your company to work in absolute unison towards one common goal. In the end, your success often comes down to the reliability of your execution. So how do we make execution reliable? With the help of effective risk management. Risk management isn't just about avoiding disaster. It's the discipline that keeps your execution intact when reality doesn't match the plan. Here are the 6 core elements where a risk-informed approach will transform your ability to deliver. The first step is clarity. You need to know who owns what. Execution gets derailed when accountability is vague. Risk management practices demand clear ownership and defined roles, making sure that for every critical task there is one person and one person alone who is responsible for the outcome. Learn that idea. Once you have clarity, you need capacity. A great plan is useless if you don't have the necessary people, technology, or budget to see it through. Risk management is all about balancing plans in terms of their potential for failures and making adjustments to reduce the risk when necessary. That approach can help you to identify and allocate the essential assets so that your execution isn't sidelined by some avoidable setback. Next, we establish early warning systems. We can't wait for a problem to become a crisis. By setting up ongoing monitoring of what we call key risk indicators, simple, measurable signals, your risk program identifies ways to spot potential problems before they ever disrupt your timeline or degrade your quality. That leads us directly to decision support. Leaders need to be prepared for the inevitable twists and turns. Disciplines like scenario planning and stress testing are what prepare your leaders to adapt their execution plans quickly and intelligently when conditions suddenly shift. You're essentially rehearsing the emergency, so it's not an emergency at all if it happens, it's just plan B. The fifth element is cross-functional alignment. In a big company, different departments can inadvertently work at odds with one another. Enterprise risk management processes ensure that every part of the organization is working towards consistent, risk-informed goals. It's how a stress is felt in one area, like an interest rate jump, then is immediately anticipated and managed by the other areas that will be impacted. And finally, we build resilience. This is about learning and improving. Post-event reviews, where we look back on what went right and what went wrong, combined with risk-adjusted metrics, mean that your teams can learn from their experiences and improve execution over time. rather than just repeating the same costly mistakes. Ultimately, what you're trying to achieve is for good execution to become a fundamental cultural expectation within your entire organization. Good execution isn't about perfect speed or pure precision. It's about reliable delivery under the chaos of real world conditions. When you effectively fuse execution discipline with smart risk management, you turn great ideas into predictable, sustainable profit. If you want to start building this culture, take a moment to look at your most recent project failure and ask yourself which of these 6 pillars was the first to crumble. In the end, what you want is an entire organization that simply expects that their efforts will lead to good execution.
Dave, this is the third of a series that you've written about how to lead to business success, kind of splitting it up into 3 different components, execution, timing, and first of all, you talked about judgment. Can you give some examples on good execution and where that's come into play, and maybe some examples where good execution hasn't worked out so well?
All right, Max, I'll give you an example or two about variable annuity hedging. There was an awful lot of mistakes made, and a few people did things right with the variable annuity hedging leading up to the financial crisis in 2008, because the variable annuities had these embedded guarantees that caused extreme movements in the value of the variable annuity contracts in the case where the stock market dropped at the amount that it actually did drop in the financial crisis. Let me first talk about execution, the idea of hedging the variable annuity contracts. Besides working with insurance companies on this, I did do a couple of projects with investment banks. And it was interesting because we kept trying to find out, I was a consultant at the time, and we kept trying to find out how the investment banks went about hedging the contracts. And they, of course, wouldn't tell us. But we were doing a project where we were doing some of the work for them on a block of variable annuities that they were thinking of acquiring for an insurance company that they owned. You could easily back into what their hedging program had to be based on the information they had requested from us. What we figured out was that the investment banks were fully cognizant that the hedging guarantees were not daily guarantees. They were long-term guarantees. They were guarantees that ran out for a decade or more. And so what they were asking us for was projections of expected cash payouts from these variable annuities so that they would do a hedge based on the cash flow expectation. If we told them, that we saw the block of business take in, $100 million in year one, and that money flew out starting in year 6 or 7 and was going out 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 years after that. They would make sure that they had long-term hedges in place at those cash flow points so that they were actually hedging the money that was moving, not the accounting for the contracts or anything. So that was pretty good execution, and they were hedging the actual risk that they had, whereas the insurance companies were picking up on literature about hedging that treated these contracts as if they were daily risks, and so that or weekly risks or something. So their hedges were something that worked for a day, for a week, and needed to be rebalanced very frequently because of that, because they were buying short-term contracts, and the contract might expire a couple of days after the time horizon even. There was an assumption in there that you'd always be able to buy the next day's contracts. What actually happened in the financial crisis was, well, they couldn't buy the next day's contracts. Nobody would sell them. Or you could buy them and they were 7 times as expensive as they were the day before, or something like that. And you had to buy a lot more of them because the potential moves in the market, if you were getting that part right even, were much higher. So the insurance companies seemed to have taken an idea that was maybe made sense in a trading desk where both the assets and liabilities were short term. And so you were hedging something that you could exit the position on either side at any time because they were relatively short duration exposures. But when the investment bank had looked at the insurance business and said, "What do I need to hedge here?" Their execution was, "No, we need to hedge for the entire period of that contract."
Yeah, that's where it becomes really important to understand the difference between the academic pricing of whether it's a financial product or even making widgets and the practitioner impact. It's always different, and you need people looking at both sides of it and comparing to each other to make sure that you succeed over the long term. I think that's a great example.
I had been at that time working at Standard and Poor's, so I managed to hear a lot of the presentations, mostly public presentations of companies about what they were doing with hedging. And I remember another company that in their public presentation showed, look at how good our hedging is. We stress the market down 20% and we're still okay. Well, the market went down a lot more than 20% in the financial crisis, and that company wasn't okay. It was one of the companies that had to be bailed out by the Fed. The execution there was poor because they just weren't executing for the possibilities that were actually out there. They were saving money it's kind of like I'm saving money by not insuring my house for a category 4 hurricane because we only have category 3 hurricanes around here is really what the thinking was there.
Well, and that's
And
where it's important to think too about what has historically happened, because I remember, we had some flooding here where I live in Omaha before the flooding happened. Oh, we never get this kind of flooding anymore. The Army Corps of Engineers done this and that. After the flooding hit, all of a sudden there were these articles about, well, there was this event in 1960 something and all that. And I think we run into that on the financial side too, that we start using statistical distributions, and that's all well and good. But I think you also want to do some deterministic scenarios where you say, well, what's the worst thing that's happened in the last 100 years, and how would this hedge work in that environment? By doing that, you may say, well, I'm going to do 50% of my hedges short term, but I'm going to also put some longer term hedges on. Might not be a complete change, but it might be just something you tweak a little bit to have a little bit more, be a little bit less fragile and a little bit more resilient.
a third example I'll have on that is that there was one company that I didn't work with when I was doing the hedging programs, but probably could have benefited with one of the projects that I did. One of the companies we did the hedging programs for, I helped to develop a process for helping them to hedge their risk of having to write off their DAC, their deferred acquisition costs. This company that didn't hire consultants to help with it. I don't think hiring consultants is the only way to get a good result. In this case, it would have helped a lot because they had zero hedging of their DAC risk. Their losses from writing off the DAC brought the value of their company after the write-offs down near zero. And this was a really substantial company. They
I
just
remember in the variable annuity market, there were companies that they had an investment arm, and so they were the owners of the mutual funds that were being invested in, as well as the insurance company putting the wrapper around it. And so they almost had a double hit from the deferred acquisition costs. When the markets went down, their assets under management went down, but it also created additional costs on the insurance side, and they just hadn't thought that through very well.
My final bad execution story I'll tell, it has to do with Hurricane Katrina. And this was a story from when I was at Standard and Poor's. One of the insurers that we talked to came in the 6 months after Hurricane Katrina. We talked to every property insurer that was rated by Standard and Poor's. And this one had losses that were, oh, I don't, probably 30, 40% higher than
proportionate to their amount of business than most other insurers had had. A lot of insurers had big losses from Katrina, but this company had like extra big losses compared to the size of their business. And so we asked them, well, what happened? And they kind of sheepishly told us was that those extra losses all came from one hospital that was a total write-off. The hospital building and all the equipment in it and everything else was insured for whatever it was, 30, $40 million. It was a quite expensive facility. And that was way above their retention limit for a single property. Their procedure was that they were supposed to have gotten facultative insurance on that or reinsurance on that when they wrote the business, but somehow or other that had fallen through the cracks. Nobody had done it, and usually they figured those things out the next time it renewed, and nobody was hurt by just waiting. In this case, total loss, and it was a big percentage increase in their total claims because their retention limit was a lot less than than the amount of that hospital. So bad execution. And by retaining that hospital, they did take on a lot more risk. And I think the starting premise here was that reward doesn't just come from taking risk. It really is highly tied to these three ideas of judgment, timing, and execution.
Let me finish up this series with these words. Profits rarely come from risk alone. They come when judgment, timing, and execution all line up. Good judgment means picking activities with a real positive payoff. Good timing means entering when market and financing conditions support the move. And good execution means delivering the plan efficiently and reliably. Miss any one of these three, and even a promising idea can lose money. Get all three right, and risk management become the fourth most important component, not the main driver of business profits.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice about using good execution with risk management, which built off discussions about good judgment and good timing. A practitioner working in the real world utilizes company culture to build a strong execution plan that provides reliable delivery. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.